بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين أما بعد. Just following up from last week. Last week we were looking mainly at one incident of the Prophet ﷺ where he began his open preaching. So he went to the top of the mountain, Mountain Safa, and from the top of that mountain he just keep them at the back of the Rashid, so if someone comes they can have it. So the Prophet ﷺ, he went to the top of the mountain and he called the whole of Makkah, the entirety, every single clan of Makkah was there, and he addressed all of them and he made this point to every single one of them and he called them to Islam. And this in itself we'll see today why, for many reasons, this incident of the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ gets everyone together, why this one incident is really the start of the Prophet ﷺ's open da'wah. Why from here we find that the Quraysh start to give the Prophet ﷺ many problems. They start to abuse him. We also find that the Prophet ﷺ, he is even his own family, his own uncles, they turn against him. So we find that problems start coming in the life of the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims. This is one of the first things. Just remembering that Mount Safa was when his uncle Abu Lahab turned against him, and that's when Surah Lahab was revealed as well after this incident. So these are a couple of the things that we keep in mind from last week. So the main point being that the Prophet ﷺ, he's now moved in his stage of da'wah. He's now preaching openly. So here we see a few different ways where the Prophet ﷺ, he does this. One of the ways is the Prophet ﷺ, he will go to the gatherings of the people of Makkah, people who worship idols. He'll go to their gatherings and he'll call towards Tawheed. He'll call towards one Allah. This is the first thing. So the many different ways the Prophet ﷺ will spread the message. But we can imagine he's going from just going to the odd one person and telling them to come Islam. And now instead of going to just that one person, he's going broadly on a much wider scale and publicly telling people who are just sitting around in groups, or people who are in the market, or people who are in whatever social spot that they may have had. He would go to these places and start actually calling them directly to Islam, a whole group of people, publicly. And if we put ourselves in the shoes of the Prophet ﷺ, this is a massive, massive step. Before, all he was doing was going to his very close friends. He goes to his wife Khadija. This is the first da'wah he does. Then he goes to Abu Bakr radiallahu, and he spreads it here and there. But he doesn't go publicly and expose himself and make himself vulnerable. The first time he done that was when he called his family, Banu Hashim, and they had the meal. After this, Mount Safa was the first time, and now this is that massive transformation. Remember, when he went to Mount Safa, he put himself completely on the line. He put all of his honor on the line. The only thing there was his honor. Otherwise, people would have done a lot of things to him. So this is what we see the difference. He's now putting things on the line. He's making himself vulnerable. Before, he wasn't exposing himself. He wasn't saying things which would have caused any problems towards him. But this is a very big difference, not only in the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ, but also the way that Makkah now perceives Islam. Just again to recap, a point which we kind of missed last week was that this sermon of the Prophet ﷺ on Mount Safa, it was what we call very suggestive. What it implied was that from now, if somebody opposes Islam or somebody doesn't come to Islam, then he will not have a relation with the Prophet ﷺ. This is kind of the message and the effect which the Prophet ﷺ got across from Mount Safa. Because obviously slowly is developing. So after 3 years, this is when this main effect actually happens, that now if somebody opposes Islam, this will affect the relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. So there's a big difference for many different reasons. This first call from Mount Safa, this made a big difference in the history of da'wah and how the Prophet ﷺ used to call people. So the first way the Prophet ﷺ now is going, he would go and call people towards Islam. This is in many different ways. Calling them towards Tawheed, this is one way of calling. There's many different ways of giving that. Or one is to invite towards something. So we invite somebody to come to the masjid, or we invite somebody to start fasting in Ramadan. This is one way you invite something. There's another thing, you stop somebody. If somebody's drinking alcohol, you tell him to stop. You invite him to stop an action. So sometimes you invite somebody to do something or stop. So Prophet ﷺ started with inviting towards Allah. Then another thing which he would do, these are in order generally of how he started da'wah. The Prophet ﷺ, he would recite the Quran publicly. So he'd come into the Kaaba, and this is very common as well. Sometimes people would come to the Prophet ﷺ with certain objections, and the Quran will very often answer. So for example, when the Prophet ﷺ was offered the wealth of Makkah, the leaders of Makkah said, we'll give you all the wealth that you want. We'll give you leadership, we'll give you all the, whichever girl you want, we'll give you that, we'll give you her. The Prophet ﷺ here in response, he recited the Quran. This is one thing he did. So again, the Quran has such an effect on the person who came to visit him that it almost transformed him. Everybody could see the effect. So the Prophet ﷺ would go publicly into the Kaaba and recite the Quran, and people would hear it. Because the Quran itself was a miracle of the time. Still, it's the one miracle we have of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran, because of the way it is, it would entrance people. People would not know how to respond to this. So this is a very big thing the Prophet ﷺ would do. And then the effect that, again, we're looking, this is a form of da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ. He goes into Kaaba and he recites the Quran. So remember, this is a form, a means of getting people to convert to Islam. Just like when you go to people and say there's one Allah, just when you go and tell people that Allah gives you everything, in the same way, to go and actually recite the Quran was another form of da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ as well. So this is one thing he would do. The third thing, he would worship Allah publicly, and this is again narrated in different narrations. Some of them we see that the Prophet ﷺ is worshipping, and then when there was a group of Quraysh sitting there and they decided to tie a knot around his neck, stuff like this which happens. So he would publicly now pray salah, and he would publicly do the ibadah of Allah. He would make dua in the Kaaba, and he would publicly worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, remember before this, we also remember that the Prophet ﷺ, before this, he would pray privately in the valley between the mountains, hiding so nobody would see him. And this is where Ali radiallahu anh, he saw him, and then Abu Talib found out. And remember that story of Ali radiallahu anh seeing him pray. So before he wasn't public, but now he would go and publicly pray. And again, this would teach people how to follow Islam. What does Islam involve? Another form of da'wah. People would sometimes see the serenity. Sometimes even when we come to this masjid, we may see somebody praying, and he may be praying with so calmly and with so much devotion that we may feel like slowing down in our own prayer. Sometimes it happens that because if somebody looks like they're enjoying themselves in their prayer, we feel like, well, how come I'm not? Or why don't I slow down as well? If everybody's rushing, it creates an environment of everybody rushing. But we just slow down that ruku, slow down the sajda. Something happens here. So this is when people see the Prophet ﷺ, they'd see the enjoyment he's getting, they'd see the serenity, they'd see his the deep state of meditation which he goes into and concentration which he has. And this itself would be a means of da'wah for them. And the last two are the opposite of the first. So the first one, you call towards Allah, and the last two you say against something else. So for example, if we call towards the masjid, or call against drinking alcohol, whatever it is, that the two examples that we have, Prophet ﷺ calls towards tawheed and against shirk, against ascribing partners to Allah. So he does both things. And in fact, scholars mention that this is something which right from the beginning all of the Anbiya were always told to do. Whenever there was an evil in society, they were required to speak against any kind of evil. And this is something, again, we are required to do, which is why when people are confused sometimes, or when we have some evil thing happen, the whole point of a press release, for example, from a masjid. So for example, if there's a terrorist attack which somebody claims to do in the name of Islam in this country, then as a masjid we would be, we can expect ourselves, because as Muslims we have this responsibility of when something wrong happens, you not only do you call towards good, but you also explain when something is wrong as well. So Prophet ﷺ, he would come, and when he would give da'wah, and this is the big problem with the Quraysh had with him, which is that when he would give da'wah, he would speak bad about the idols, and they would then obviously say that he's cursing the religion of our forefathers. And this is something which Islam is a religion of thinking, of making a decision yourself, understanding Islam, acting upon tawheed, not just following what people were doing. So obviously these people, they claimed to follow the religion of Ibrahim alayhi, but they had gone astray. So the Prophet would tell this to them, and he would tell them what's wrong and what's right. And this is what they would hate, because they couldn't have somebody going around disgracing the thing which their livelihood depended on. So because they depended on it, so this would cause them to have hatred for the Prophet ﷺ. In the same way, today when we do this, sometimes we'll have hatred for us. Sometimes we have evils in our society which have to be sometimes called out. So it doesn't just work. Da'wah is not just to do that. Sometimes if we know somebody is doing a certain sin, then sometimes we can advise him ourselves. Sometimes if it's got public, if it's the public danger, if this person is doing something which is causing harm to the public, then sometimes it becomes necessary to stop him physically with your hand. If that's not possible, sometimes it even becomes necessary to report these people to the authorities. And this is something which is very clear in Islam, that when somebody is doing dhulm on the general masses, then to stop his oppression, to stop his wrongdoing, then it's necessary to make sure that the people who can stop him are made aware, because Islam has rules. Islam has the right thing and the wrong thing. If somebody is doing something evil, and because of his evil other people are being harmed, other people are being oppressed, then it's very necessary that these people don't just stand there watching him, but they have to make sure that this person is stopped before it becomes a bigger problem. So this is something which sometimes in our culture we have very close ties with each other. So sometimes we find it difficult to report against somebody who's very close to us. But this is something which really is can cause a lot of problems in our culture. So this is something which we see that Prophet ﷺ would disapprove of certain things and approve and invite towards Allah. So now the Prophet ﷺ, when he done this, people now are coming towards Islam. But one of the issues which happens now compared to before the Mount Safa incident, if somebody converted to Islam, they didn't have that many problems. They were not opposed a lot. But now when somebody embraces Islam, they are caused a lot of problems. People will start torturing them, people will not speak to them, people will stay away from them. And many examples of these, this is one of the methods which were used by the Quraysh in order to prevent people from going to Islam. There's many different methods they use. One of them is this torture, and to many different things which they used to do to the Muslims. And this is something we'll touch upon later. But now the next thing which we notice is that the Prophet ﷺ, he came, he gave da'wah on the Mount Safa, and then we had two uncles who gave two responses. And this proves the point that we said, that the Prophet ﷺ came with open da'wah, but this da'wah now proves that from now, if somebody doesn't support Islam, if somebody goes against Islam, then that relation would be less strong than even a blood relation. If somebody comes into Islam, he becomes more related and more closer to the Prophet ﷺ than even the blood relatives of the Prophet ﷺ. And he may have had blood relatives who left Islam and went away from Islam, and they ended up becoming further than the blood relatives of the Prophet ﷺ. Now this is actually living in Britain, it doesn't make as much sense. As for example, if we were back in our home countries, for example, especially in Pakistan, you see it a lot. I'm sure we have it more in our countries than we do in this country, which is that tribal kind of mentality, where a person's very close with his family. We see it in our elders as well. They make sure that they know every part of their family, their uncles and all their cousins, and how they're related to each other, because the tribe is very, very important. I mean, in our countries, if you're somebody's cousin, second or third cousin, they will happily let you stay in their house for 2 or 3 weeks without saying anything, because you're part of the family. Now we can see this even today if we go back to our countries. So in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the tribal culture was much stronger. In fact, if you were part of a tribe, you would fight for the tribe without question. You would die for that tribe without question. This is something normal. So you have your tribe, and if your tribe goes to war, whether you understand, accept, agree or disagree, you will go to war and you will join in that battle. So this is something which was understood. The family was very, very close. Whatever their leaders decided, everybody goes with them. So now, this is why this point is actually a lot stronger. We can try and understand it today, but because of the way our culture is, especially in this country, we won't be able to understand it as it actually was, because we haven't actually experienced that kind of family life which existed within the Quraysh, because their families were literally everything for them. So the Prophet ﷺ, now his two uncles, one of them, essentially Abu Lahab ended up leaving Banu Hashim. Banu Hashim came together and decided to support the Prophet. Abu Lahab left. That blood connection which he had, it was no longer relevant, because he did not like Islam. So Abu Lahab, he ended up leaving this whole tribe, and the problems which he caused to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ came and he was calling towards Islam. Abu Lahab came and opposed the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Talib supported the Prophet ﷺ. Now Abu Lahab, despite being the direct blood uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Lahab, what he did is he opposed the Prophet ﷺ, and then he told his two sons, Utbah and Utayba, who were both married to the daughters of the Prophet ﷺ, Ruqayya and Kulthum. He told his two sons to divorce the two daughters of the Prophet ﷺ. Now obviously, for any, obviously when they would have been married to the daughters, they would have been so close and they would have found this difficult, but he literally forced his sons to do this. He said unless they do this, then he would not let them come into his house. So either they divorced him or they left his house, or they became homeless. And obviously because family is so important, if they disown him, they don't really have another family to go to. Family is the main thing there. So this person, he divorced both the daughters of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is one of the most painful things for the Prophet ﷺ. His own uncle, he's telling his sons to divorce his daughters even though they were in marriage, and this is something which was very, very hard. And it further proves the point that this original open preaching, it really meant that when somebody came into Islam, coming into Islam was a stronger bond than having blood relations, because even the wives were divorced at that point. Not only were wives divorced, but the own uncle of the Prophet ﷺ was telling his sons to separate from the Prophet ﷺ on the basis of Islam. So this is two ways that we see that the Prophet ﷺ, he's now being a lot more suggestive and saying to the people that now either you come to Islam or you break ties with me. This is the very clear thing which the Prophet ﷺ said at this point. So we find from the two uncles, so we have Abu Lahab and we have Abu Talib. Abu Talib is the brother of Abu Lahab. They are the same uncles. They are both the sons of Abdul Muttalib. So they're both brothers of each other, and now obviously because of this dispute they started to hate each other. They started to have opposition with each other, because one is supporting Islam, one is against Islam. Abu Lahab did not sit on the fence like Abu Talib originally sits on the fence a little bit. Then we find out his true colours a little bit later. But with Abu Lahab, right from the beginning, he was against Islam. Even before Islam, he caused a lot of problems for the Muslims. So this is something which Abu Lahab done. Now the problem which the Quraysh had is that Abu Talib was essentially what nowadays we call the guardian. Again, because of their family structure, Abu Talib was in charge of the Prophet ﷺ. So we had the clan of the Prophet ﷺ, which was the Banu Hashim, and this was led by Abu Talib. So Abu Talib was in charge of this clan. Now they can't go direct to the Prophet ﷺ, because that's not how things work. Even now, if you think of back home countries, those of us that have been, we know it works very similar like this. If somebody's son or nephew or grandson is doing something, they go to the granddad and the uncle and the dad, rather than going to the son. In this country it's a little bit different, but over there that's how it works. So you go to them, you say to them, look, what's this nephew of yours doing, what's this son of yours doing, and then they have a chat with him and they sort him out. So however, we'd expect them to go to the Prophet ﷺ, but for them, remember, it all works on family, it all works on tribes. You can't just bypass the leader and go and speak to a member of the tribe. When the problem is this big, and Abu Talib knows the problem is big, they have to go to Abu Talib. So this is the first thing, they have to go, they can't bypass him. This shows how important Abu Talib actually was for the Muslims and Islam at that time. If he wasn't there, they wouldn't have had this protection. The fact that he took sides with the Prophet ﷺ meant a lot, and he supported the Prophet ﷺ. So he supported them, and this is something that we see that they couldn't say anything to the Prophet ﷺ until they had at least tried to negotiate with Abu Talib. If Abu Talib had been like Abu Lahab and just been the same and opposed Islam and said, I'm going to stay with my forefathers, then essentially he would have had very little support, because his own tribal leader would have turned against him and they would have happily. Now we'll see the details of this, how the Prophet ﷺ, they tried to get him and tried to get Abu Talib to give them permission to speak to the Prophet ﷺ.